and also your host for today. I will begin today's webinar with a few instructions. Please note that closed captioning is available and can be accessed by clicking on the Show Captions option at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Throughout the event, you're free to ask questions in the chat, and that will be taken up in the Q&A. We also invite you to join the conversation on social media using hashtag IDW2026 and to tag OCIC, and we are on Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook. OCIC is committed to creating a safe and inclusive space. We ask all of you to commit to a code of conduct inspired by those of the Intercouncil Network and Amnesty Canada. This code of conduct, which Mishka will now share on the chat, outlines our shared commitments towards respect, inclusion, humility, safety, solidarity, patience, and openness for all participants and collaborators. Before I get into today's agenda, I would like to begin by sharing that OCIC recognizes and honors the Indigenous peoples who have historically and do presently live and work on the traditional, both treaty and unceded territories that we operate on. These include the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas of the Credit River First Nation, and many others. We acknowledge that as staff, board, volunteers, members, and broader community operate on the treaty and unceded territories of these and numerous other Indigenous peoples and nations. As we reflect on our role within a settler colonial context, we acknowledge the importance of naming the Indigenous peoples and nations on whose lands we live, work, and play, and understand the importance of framing our engagement in the international cooperation sector and beyond through the lens of reconciliation and decolonization. We recognize that we have a responsibility to stand in solidarity with Indigenous peoples who have and continue to fight for social justice on their own lands. With that, it is now my honor to welcome and introduce Ms. Sarah Hendricks. Sarah Hendricks serves as the UN Women's Director of Policy, Program, and Intergovernmental Support Division. In this role, she drives UN Women as a global thought and practice leader through cutting-edge policy analysis, strategic guidance to field programming, and intergovernmental support to normative advancements for gender equality. Since August 2024, she also served as the head of secretariat for the UN Secretary General's Gender Equality Acceleration Plan. She has over 2 decades of work across multi-stakeholder partners, including with the government, public sector, foundations, nonprofits, and research institutions. Prior to joining UN Women, Ms. Hendricks served as the Director of Gender Equality, Global Growth, and Opportunity at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, developing the foundation's first ever strategy on gender equality and women's economic empowerment, and also as Global Advisor on Gender Equality and HIV/AIDS at Plan International Canada, leading the Canada government's coordinated investment on HIV/AIDS and youth in Africa. It is now my absolute pleasure to hand it over to Ms. Hendricks for her opening remarks.
Thank you so much indeed, Pragya. And it is really my honor to be here with all of you today. And thank you to the Ontario Council for International Cooperation for this invitation, and to all of you who are joining across Canada, but indeed across the world on this important day. Transnational feminist activism for peace is at least more than 100 years old. And the reason we actually commemorate the year 2000 and the Security Council Resolution 1325 is not only because that is when the idea that gender equality matters for peace really gained a foothold in the United Nations Security Council, but also it's because that is really when governments right over the world began to incorporate this into their national policies. And so Security Council Resolution 1325, or just commonly known as 1325, really has many mothers, and it has many different origin stories. But most of them will tell you that there were 4 governments that played a very leading role at the turn of the century in bringing these issues to the main international body in charge of peace and security. And three of those were countries from the global south: Bangladesh, Jamaica, and Namibia. And I think this is an important reminder for those that try to erase history and claim this agenda as some kind of outside or Western imposition. The fourth country, of course, was Canada. Canadian initiatives have written so many important chapters of the story of 1325. For example, one of the clearest examples of progress over the past quarter century is that gender-based crimes in war are no longer shrouded in silence. The atrocities committed against women and girls are now thoroughly investigated and documented by the UN and others, and they are put on the historical record so that justice may be done one day. In some cases, justice has been done. Thousands of survivors of sexual violence have received reparations. Hundreds of commanders, soldiers, and rebels have been convicted of sexual violence in war. 15 years ago, this was not the case. The international courts had just begun putting together quite important and impressive jurisprudence, but national courts in war-torn countries had almost never put anyone on the dock for these crimes. We had nowhere near the level of documentation and evidence that we collect now. And many partners across the world, including UN Women, really wanted to do something about this. And as UN Women, we asked for help, and Canada answered. First, we got the Secretary General to mandate that every UN investigation should include expertise on the investigation and documentation of gender-based crimes. Then we entered into an agreement with the High Commissioner for Human Rights to really help the High Commissioner deploy that expertise. And then we found the right partners, many of you likely across this table today, to build a roster with all the best experts in the world, many of them fresh off their experience with the international courts for then Yugoslavia, Rwanda, or Sierra Leone. The first couple of years, we could only deploy a handful of experts. But as we worked out the operational challenges inherent in rapid deployments, that became much more progressive. And by the time Canada became one of the main funders in this area of work, we were deploying more than 20 such experts every year to every commission of inquiry, every fact-finding mission, and investigative mechanism created by the General Assembly, and even the International Criminal Court. And so much of the documentation of gender-based crimes in UN documents over the past 15 years actually comes from these deployments. And I hope this historical trajectory is not only interesting, but important for you. It has made such a real difference. And I think I say with pride, as a Canadian working at the UN, Canada has been at the center of it. If you hear the Secretary General give examples of progress in this area, one of them is that the percentage of women in peacekeeping missions has actually doubled in recent years, right across all categories. And again, nothing happens without concerted efforts. And this is one of those places where that is also true. By the 15th anniversary of 1325, the percentage of women amongst blue helmets had actually been stuck at about 3% for many, many years. Really, in spite of resolutions, in spite of statements calling for this incessantly, as if just saying something would make it become so. UN Women then proposed the use of financial incentives for what are called troop contributing countries into peacekeeping, and formulated how that would work, and really modeled this after other premiums and incentives that had really been baked into the peacekeeping budget, and then calculated how much that would cost. And while these proposals were acknowledged, really no one wanted to take the lead. And 2 years later, the number of women peacekeepers had gone from 2,952 to 2,982, a very small incremental improvement. And that's when Canada again stepped up. And Canada stepped up and created something called the ELSI Initiative and the ELSI Initiative Fund, with an initial investment of $15 million back in 2017, trusting UN Women with that fund that actually quickly attracted the attention and investment of other donors as well. And at the time, this was the largest one-time pledge of money by a donor country ever committed to improve the gender balance of UN peacekeeping operations. And 8 years later, the percentage of women had more than doubled after barely budging the previous 2 decades. Canada has answered the call many other times, as we highlighted in the underfunding of women-led organizations in conflict-affected countries, and got the Secretary General to endorse a minimum target of 1% of ODA to conflict-affected countries being channeled through women's rights organization. That actually led to a tripling of current levels, or of then current levels, I should say. And Canada again became a model for many other donors, launching the Equality Fund that we all know so well, contributing meaningfully to the UN's Women, Peace, and Humanitarian Fund, which UN Women is honored to host for the entire UN system for this purpose, really to drive that necessary flexible financing into women's rights and women-led organizations on the ground. And when we collectively call for accountability, we also saw Canada step up to impose sanctions on perpetrators of conflict-related sexual violence, take the Taliban to the International Court of Justice for systemic violations of the Convention to End All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, otherwise known as CEDAW. And really, when we look for good practice when it comes to developing and implementing national action plans on women, peace, and security, there are many governments right across the world that are mentioned, but Canada is mentioned very often. And I say all of this to show how an intentional posture, an intentional effort makes such a difference, and particularly when that's driven by feminist international assistance. Regardless of nomenclature, there are now, I think, more and more countries influenced by that. And there are now 116 countries that have adopted national action plans on women, peace, and security. I will say that many of those action plans, as impressive as they are underfunded. Many of them actually are entirely unfunded. And at the very minimum, what they do is they often provide a space for interaction for women's organizations with government actors working on peace and security. In many cases, they have actually helped to set targets for increased representation of women in the justice and security sectors, targets that were either rare or non-existent before. And millions of survivors of gender-based violence in conflict-affected countries are actually supported with services that barely existed just 2 decades ago. Better gender analysis, more sex disaggregated data, women's inclusion in humanitarian planning has brought about, I think, more tailored attention to women's needs in humanitarian emergencies, from food insecurity in female-headed households to reproductive health and reproductive violence. Maternal mortality rates and out-of-school rates for girls, we've seen that steady decline from way back in 1995 through 2020. And women have built pockets of peace in their communities, really focusing on women's role, women's leadership and voice in preventing local conflicts that never made the global highlights and headlines in our newspapers, but nevertheless mattered so much to instill peace and prevent conflict. But I do want to say, in spite of all of this progress on 1325, we have, as a world, fallen short in some of the most important respects. We did not stop the upward trajectory of military spending. And we did not change the face of politics and power. At peace tables, the percentage of women is still in single digits, and their exclusion only seems to deepen with this new generation of peace deals that do not stop the violence and, in many ways, sideline the UN entirely. Women are still hugely underrepresented in decision-making, especially in conflict-affected countries, and especially amongst the most powerful countries that drive much of what happens in international peace and security. In the 25 years since 1325 was adopted, military spending doubled, quickly approaching $3 trillion annually. And just to put things into perspective, the annual budget of UN peacekeeping missions amounts to about 0.2% of the current levels of military spend. And I think the UN is struggling just to keep that itself solvent. Rising military spending and attacks on multilateralism really are not making our world safer. I think the opposite is happening. We now have the highest number of active conflicts since 1946. And the same actors that claim that we have to get back to basics and focus on peace and security, and that gender equality, human rights, or climate change have nothing to do with that, are busy actually shrinking the UN footprint on peace and security, and in many ways setting up very costly parallel structures. And what we do see is very similar misogyny that poisons domestic politics in many countries, actually fueling global conflict. And I think at its essence, what we see is that women and girls are paying the price of the wars of men. Wars are being waged on the bodies of women and girls with shocking disregard for international law, shocking disregard for the disturbing levels of cruelty. Civilian casualties amongst women and children actually quadrupled. Please take that in. Quadrupled compared to only 2 years ago. Sexual violence in conflict rose by 87% in just 2 years. 58% of all maternal deaths take place in the worst crisis countries of the world, across 29 crisis countries. And this is likely to get worse and worse after so many reports of blocked reproductive health care, bombed maternity wards and hospitals, as well as organized backlash against women's reproductive health and rights. In Gaza and in Afghanistan, most women and girls report very high levels of anxiety, depression, and trauma. And 53% of displaced Ukrainian women are reporting suffering significant levels of depression. I think it is also destroying our progress across global goals when we think about the SDGs, whether that's eliminating extreme poverty or eliminating hunger or just girls' enrollment in schools. I think everyone across this table knows about Afghan women and girls being banned from school beyond 6th grade. But when we look right across the world, there are millions upon millions of other girls deprived from an education because of conflict. In Haiti, to Myanmar, or from the Sudan to the Sahel region. And really changing the face of power and embracing women's leadership is one of the most promising pathways out of these very, very disturbing times. This is not just UN Women's conviction. I know many of you across the table share that conviction as well. Amid all that is happening in this era of unchecked brutality, in this era of brazen disregard for all established norms, there were hundreds of events just last year that the world undertook in October as we commemorated that anniversary of 1325, that so important 25th anniversary, whether that was right in the Security Council or in the streets of Namibia, to countless events right across every region. The idea that gender equality matters for peace is universal, and it will endure, and it will survive this backlash, and it will survive the next one too. But if we want to escape the current downward spiral of more conflict and less democracy and really finally fulfill the promise of 1325, we have to be willing to adjust to this rapidly changing world. The international community has focused on transnational security and international legal institutions for the last 25 years, but they have not focused enough on building social movements, on fostering social norm change. Women, peace, and security has become highly visible in global capitals right around the world, and even in many cities in conflict-affected countries. But information and funding, policy implementation, and services do not typically reach the most important local areas where the greatest challenges are experienced. And as funding is reduced, we have to be far more vigilant and far more disciplined at green lighting initiatives that can be perceived as wasteful or redundant. We have to be able to measure our impact in the number of women that meaningfully participate in peace and security processes or receive genuine relief in the form of justice and reparations and services or asylum. In many contexts, partnering with governments the way we have been for the last 25 years may not be possible. Instead, we may be asked to find ways to protect feminist activists at imminent risks, or find new pathways to channel funds to unregistered organizations like we successfully did in Afghanistan or in Myanmar. Instead of amplifying the voice of very established civil society partners, we may need to find ways of providing spaces for dialogue for women in resistance movements. The future success of the agenda will depend on its ability really to reach new audiences, to make meaning, to open dialogue across generations, and to find young people a chance for renewal and for perseverance. I think those are some of our expectations, my own expectations for the future. And I fully expect Canadian civil society and the Canada government to really be at the front lines of shaping that future, of mobilizing those that want to protect our collective values, our collective principles, and the international architecture that helped usher such historic gains in peace and security and human improvement over these last 80 years, that helped to usher forward such changes for women and girls the world over. Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to today's important discussion.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that grounding and powerful reflection, highlighting both tangible gains of the Women, Peace and Security agenda and also the urgency of adapting our approaches to women's leadership that can truly reshape our peace and security in this moment. It is a useful context now that we transition into our panel portion, where we will hear from experienced international cooperation actors and their WPS interventions, research, and impacts in both local and global communities. But before that, I would like to introduce you to our moderator for today's session, Isabella Ong. Isabella is a research fellow at the Myanmar Policy and Community Knowledge Hub at University of Toronto. She is also a Shangri-La Dialogue Young Leader and at the University of British Columbia, the Myanmar Initiative Fellow. Her research interests include women, peace and security, and women's political activism and participation and minority rights. Her regional expertise is Canada and Southeast Asia, with a focus on Myanmar. With that, I will pass it over to you, Isabella.
Thank you for the introduction, Pragya. It is my pleasure to be the moderator of this wonderful panel today. My name is Isabella Ong, and I am an Indigenous Mon and Karen women's rights advocate with ancestors from Myanmar. I am a research fellow focusing on women, peace, and security at the University of Toronto, and I study grassroots women's rights and political participation in active conflict regions with a focus on Myanmar. About 25 years ago, the United Nations Security Council adopted Resolution 1325, which is the landmark resolution on women, peace, and security. This resolution reaffirms the important role of women in the prevention and resolution of conflicts, peace negotiating, peace building, peacekeeping, humanitarian responses, and post-conflict reconstruction. It highlights the importance of women's equal participation and full involvement in all efforts of the maintenance and promotion of the peace and the security. This resolution urges all the actors to increase participation of women and incorporate gender perspectives in all the United Nations peace and security efforts. It calls on all parties in conflict to take special measures to protect women and girls from gender-based violence and armed conflict. It also urges the member states, the United Nations, and other relevant actors to address the circumstances surrounding women, peace, and security. As of today, 79 countries, including Canada, have established national action plans on women, peace, and security to advance this agenda. Canada launched its very first national action plan in 2010 for the 2011 to 2016 period. Following that, the second national action plan covered the period from 2017 to 2022, and today we have Canada's third national action plan in place for the period from 2023 to 2029. The current National Action Plan is aptly titled Foundations for Peace, Canada's National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. Anti-gender and anti-feminist movements are growing today, and backlash against human rights is gaining traction both within Canada and around the world, and both online and in person as well. At the same time, women are on the front lines building peace. Reflecting on these circumstances and learning from the previous two national action plans, Canada's third national action plan includes bridging the divide between the domestic and international implementation of the women, peace, and security agenda, developing an intersectional feminist approach, and strengthening partnerships with civil society and Indigenous peoples. I am delighted to welcome our esteemed panelists who will share their expertise and perspectives on Canada's women, peace, and security today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Emily Weissman, Dr. Yolan Buka, and Dr. Emma Richardson. Can everyone see the bio slides? I seem to not have it on my screen. Perfect. So our first panelist, Dr. Emily Weissman, is the Director of Gender Justice and Impact at CARE Canada, where she leads a team of technical experts specializing in gender equality and inclusion, monitoring and evaluation, and climate change. Dr. Weissman holds a PhD in gender policy and programming and brings over a decade of experience working with NGOs, the Government of Canada, and the United Nations system. Next, we have Dr. Yolan Buka. Dr. Buka is the Canada Research Chair on Afrofeminist Thought and Political Transformation and an Associate Professor of Gender and Politics and International Relations at Queen's University in Canada. She is also the co-director of the Minds-funded Research Network on Women, Peace and Security. Her research focuses on gender, political violence, race, and international relations. She is also the recipient of the 2021 International Studies Association Feminist Theory and Gender Studies Section Early Career Community Engagement Award. Finally, we have Dr. Emma Richardson. She is a senior public servant, economist, and academic with extensive experience in diplomacy, international institutions, economic policy, peace building, and human rights. She has held several senior roles at Global Affairs Canada, including serving as Deputy Director of Peacekeeping. In addition to her diplomatic work, Dr. Richardson has worked with the United Nations in Central America and conducted research with Indigenous women in Guatemala with a focus on gender, health, and human rights. She is trilingual in English, French, and Spanish. Her remarks will draw on her professional experience in Guatemala, Mexico, and Bolivia, and participants are welcome to engage with her in Spanish or French. To get us started, I would like to invite our panelists to share the context of their work and the connections between their work, the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda, and the agenda's implementation in Canada. Who would like to go first?
I'm happy to get us started. Thanks, Isabella. Hi, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I'm on behalf of Care Canada. So first, I want to say Care Canada is a member of the Women, Peace and Security Network Canada, which is an incredible network of organizations and individuals that are working on the issue of women, peace and security, both domestically and internationally. And this group has done really tremendous thought leadership over the last many years, over a decade. And they recently published a really fantastic report around women, peace and security at 25, looking at the CNAP. So I highly recommend, and CNAP is Canada's National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. So I highly recommend, if you have a few minutes, head over to their webpage and have a look at that report, because it really covers a lot of interesting touch points that I'm sure we'll all speak to today. And Care Canada was really fortunate to be able to include two pieces, one on gender, climate, and peace and security, as well as one on Gaza. So I just wanted to start off there because I think it's such a great resource for anyone interested in learning more. In terms of the work that Care Canada does, Care Canada really takes a holistic approach to pursuing the women, peace and security agenda, identifying the gaps in mainstream pursuits, and then reconceptualizing the ways that we can further that agenda. So between 2015 and 2025, our work has been able to contribute to SDG 16 around peace, justice, and strong institutions. And we've been able to support 8.7 million people with a focus on women and girls in order to increase their meaningful participation and decision-making across 55 countries. And I start with that because I think that was a really fantastic effort that we've been able to make. But as was touched on with the global cuts that we're seeing in aid, a lot of this work is now in jeopardy. We're at a moment of seeing sweeping financial cuts, predominantly affecting women-led organizations and women's rights organizations. We're seeing disruptions with programming being shut down. We're seeing the work of women's rights organizations being deprofessionalized. We're seeing this with our own partners. And we're at a moment when, as a sector, we want to be advancing decolonization and localization and increasing participation and seeing more women at peace negotiations and at the table. And without authentic and localized leadership, this really won't happen. So one of the things that we've been doing at Care Canada in pursuit of 1325 and the CNAP is we've really invested heavily in programs like Women's Voice and Leadership that build coalitions, embrace women human rights defenders, ensure flexibility of funding to women-led organizations through core funding, and making sure structurally excluded groups are represented, and wherever possible, stepping back and ceding space to organizations that otherwise would not have a voice. And we think this is especially important in this moment because UN Women released a report back in October that 1/3 of organizations working to end violence against women have had to suspend their programming or have had to shut down their programming as a result of aid cuts. And we've seen this the impacts of this within our own programming as well, specifically in Ethiopia's Tigray region, but also in Sudan, where we're seeing overwhelming demand for services in response to cases of GBV and having to have impossible discussions around exceeding caseload standards or turning away survivors. And this is a direct result of the global aid cuts that we've seen over the last year. And so with indications that even Canada is going to pursue cuts as well in favor of more military spending and more economic and trade priorities, we're really quite concerned that core life-saving services and core supports to women-led and women's rights organizations are going to be further diminished, which will put in jeopardy our pursuits related to 1325 and women, peace, and security.
Thank you very much for sharing, Dr. Weissman, and thank you for highlighting the seriousness of the funding cut situations, and despite all of this, for pushing through with your work for women's peace and security. I would hand it over to Dr. Buka.
Good morning, everyone. It's lovely to be here. I'm so grateful to be part of this panel. I am in the field of research and specifically academic research adding a link below on the Research Network on Women, Peace and Security, that happens to work closely with the Women, Peace and Security Network Canada on different initiatives. Some of us were together yesterday, actually, working with the Department of Defense. Our network is funded by the Department of Defense. We are trying to bridge the gap, or we're trying to bring together people from the academy, people from civil society organizations, and the Ministry of Defense to kind of get this overall understanding of women, peace, and security. It's a very challenging, but it's also a very generative endeavor to try to see in the militarized world, but also in the civilian world, where we can find intersecting points of convergence, where we can work together, use the evidence-based research, use day-to-day experiences and a wild field of theorizing experiences that can help support Canada's approach to defense that is very particular and it's quite different from some of our allies around the world. And as someone who is keen on demilitarization, sometimes I have to have very kind of challenging but also important conversations with those who work in the space that is supposed to provide security for Canadians, broadly speaking. On the side, I also work with collaborators at Queen's University with Stephanie Martel and Dr. Stephanie Von Lackey on comparing approaches to women, peace, and security. 1325 came out. Every country has taken different things that are important to them to use in their foreign policy, in their domestic policies. But I'm looking at what the African Union and regional organizations in Africa understand to be WPS and what their priorities are. My colleagues look at ASEAN and at NATO. And with that, we're hoping to help train the next generation of practitioners, scholars, and security and defense workers in the field of women, peace, and security. And we're also trying to make the field more legible to the general public in a time of polycrisis, in a time where there's a great deal of gender backlash, in a time where hard security, and I put that in quotes, is considered to be the priority, when we know from research and experience that we cannot get to that said security without paying attention to systemic inequalities around the world.
Thank you very much, Dr. Buka, for sharing your research and academic expertise, as well as bringing in perspectives focusing on the African Union and connecting your work in Canada as well as beyond the borders as well. Next, I will hand over to Dr. Richardson.
Hi. Firstly, I wanted to say thank you so much for having us. I wanted to, in the chat, I don't think everyone can see this, but I just wanted to read this because we can see it as the panelists. I hope it's okay with this person that I read this. It says, I am Mahmoudul Hassan, originally from Myanmar, but currently residing in a refugee camp in Bangladesh. I am a genocide survivor. I am very happy and grateful to see you here. Thank you so much. So I think that really speaks to the effective way that you've brought us together, literally from around the world. And I look forward to hearing from audience members. Also, because I have rarely experienced such severe imposter syndrome as I'm experiencing in this instant. I was asked to speak, I believe, a little bit to Indigenous perspectives on women, peace, and security. I have a couple of caveats and I'll work them in. But as you can see behind me, I am a mother. So I'm definitely a woman. I've given birth 4 times. And I was Deputy Director for Peacekeeping at Global Affairs Canada for a short time. We did do quite a lot of work on making sure that the individual projects that were working their way through the pipeline at Global Affairs for peacekeeping did have a rigorous gender analysis, a GBA plus analysis. That was part of the work that we helped to work on when I was there. My current position is Senior Advisor at Indigenous Services Canada. However, all opinions are my own. I'm not coming in representation of Indigenous services today. That's part of the reason I'm using this background. just to emphasize, because my role there is not public facing. I work on economic development. Now, having said that, my previous role was to represent Canada at UN Women and UN Population Fund. And so I actually met Sarah Hendricks, who gave that very comprehensive introduction. In her role, she's the highest ranking Canadian, I'm almost certain, at UN Women. And so when I would deliver Canada's statements to UN Women, she would be, on the other side receiving those statements. So it's really nice to reconnect again today. My PhD research followed on from a decade of work in Central America and with the United Nations. And through my research and also just through living and working in Nicaragua, Honduras, and then Guatemala, I got a not firsthand view, but a closer view of the crushing, overlapping layers of discrimination facing Indigenous women in Central America. And then when I returned to Canada in 2009, as with a lot of things, I had this idea in my head that we were so much farther ahead. And lo and behold, we're not. We really aren't. And I think, I'll come back to that theme, but yeah, there's a lot of uncomfortable parallels. Let's put it that way. And the last point I wanted to make, just about my recent experience as a Canadian, as a woman, many of us watched, I would say, in horror, with the impunity with which Canadian hockey players, the impunity that they benefited from when they were put on trial for sexual violence against a woman who was called M in the media to protect her identity. And I saw, I watched, read every article, and just it was like one of those slow motion car accidents, you can't look away. But just the way that our judicial system puts the victim or the survivor on trial instead of the young men. And so I think gender-based violence in Canada is meant to be an important part of this third Women, Peace and Security strategy. And I just, keep reminding that, I think we all know this here today, but in other spheres in which I'm moving recently, it's not even, we've sort of forgotten about it already. And I think we need to be able to keep, like Yolande was already saying, keep making those connections across different parts of our society, to understand women, peace, and security in context for our Canadian policy, but also globally. So looking very forward, and I will hold myself to 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Richardson, for sharing not only your professional experience, but also weaving in your lived expertise as well. So we will start with the next question. How far has Canada actually progressed on its women, peace, and security commitments over the past 25 years? And where do the gaps remain the most visible? So we will go in the reverse order this time. So we'll start with Dr. Richardson, Dr. Buka, and then Dr. Weissman.
Okay, I'll try to be brief. This is one of the questions where I was mostly planning to defer to the other panelists, but I do have 2 examples that I would like to share that I think reflect that those kind of international othering, that we were just talking about. So and again, with the caveat, I really wish there were an Indigenous woman sitting here right now. And I think for your next panel, I'm happy to help try and connect with Indigenous organizations. It doesn't have to be Indigenous-led organizations. It can just be a person who is Indigenous who works anywhere in the development sphere, I would say, would be far better placed than me, but I will do my best. So I want to take us back to the Hudbay trial. So Hudbay is a mining company, Canadian mining company, went to Guatemala, decided they were going to be mining, and their private security dragged Indigenous landowners off of the land, tortured, maimed men, and raped Indigenous women. Some of these Indigenous women traveled to Canada to enter into our judicial system to try and hold Hudbay to account. And ultimately what happened was they were given a settlement. an anonymous, secret amount of money. Now, while I hope it's a massive amount of money, I fear that it was tiny. And the reason I suspect that it was tiny is because a friend of mine, was kind of confirmed last week. We were discussing his research at OCIC here in Toronto with about the peace accords in Guatemala and how what women wrote down, what they were asking for. They would ask for un poquito de ayuda, a little bit of help, after losing their husbands, after remaining war widows due to human rights violations during the Civil War. And so it just shows kind of for him, his research is about, what does that show in terms of the layers of subjugation, that all they felt that they could even ask for is just un poquito, a little bit of help. And so that image of people being dragged off their own property or dragged off the land. Also, I was discussing with a colleague of mine at Indigenous Services Canada. He is himself Indigenous, and he was saying, the parallels. You think to British Columbia, the Wet'suwet'en, who were dragged off by police, and they were just trying to defend their land. Now, I'm an economist by training, so I come at property rights, with a lot of, I agree, generally with property rights, but we have gone way too far, way too many times, and Canada is no exception. So I would say the question is, where are the gaps? And I would say the gaps are therefore wide ones of injustice, whether it's near or far. And though we do have lots of jargon and window dressing and initiatives and, revamping this and revamping that, we're still very incredibly far from where we need to be. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a very good question. And thank you, Emma, for kind of bringing the global back to the local. And I think this is something that I've always been very adamant about explaining to the partners with whom I engage, that it's difficult to do well abroad when you struggle to do well domestically. And I think this is a space where we can be frank with each other. I think Canada does a lot of things very well when it comes to gender equality. But it also has struggles with a variety of issues. When we think about 25 years ago, one of the kind of motivating factors, at least one of the stories of origins, because there's many of them, in terms of the motivation behind Canada's activation around WPS had, of course, something to do with what was going on around the world, but also what was happening domestically, which was femicide. Femicide is a global issue, and it was also a reality in Canada, whether it was in school settings and particularly with Indigenous women. And so, interestingly enough, for a very long time, the approach of the Canadian government and Canadian society about WPS was one that was outward looking at how you can provide support to the global community on WPS without necessarily looking at how to do so at home. What is comforting to see is the type of consultation that has been taking place recently over how the CNAP is designed and the types of ways in which accountability mechanism trying to be included in them by looking at what's happening domestically. And yet, we continue to struggle. So, one of the things that I'm really grateful about the recent CNAP is the different ways in which colonialism, racial inequality, economic inequality, gender identity, and the various ways in which Canadian society needs to look at WPS. Some of these elements are very well included in the document, and as people are already starting to advocate and agitate for the next round of CNAP, these are conversations that are going well. But now it's implementation, and implementation has to do with how things are prioritized, how things are budgeted, and how people are held accountable for the commitments that they make. And that's why we actually struggle quite a bit, not only domestically, but also internationally. Canada is a country where you have the most per capita mining headquarters, and that informs should help us think about how mining and extractive companies are engaging abroad in marginalized communities, and it's linked, as Emma was saying, to how they engage with minority societies and communities here in Canada, and how women are disproportionately impacted. And I could give you tons of examples, but I know that I only have 3 minutes, and I want to finish with this. CBC News recently reported that 5 CAF members quit the Women Veterans Council, citing lack of real outcomes. So we have those councils and we have those bodies and we have frameworks and we have policy stated priorities. But one thing that is really lacking and that we really need to pay attention to is how do you actually measure outcome? And that's something that we need to think a little bit more about, and then holding our institutions accountable. That's very difficult in a world where in a community like us, we know what WPS acronyms mean, we know what GBA plus means, but if I walk down the street, most people don't know what that is. The only way to keep government institutions accountable is usually when citizens value the same things, understand the language, and can then hold their elected representative accountable. So there's also a little bit of work in terms of public education about what those normative frameworks are about, and that's where the work needs to be.
Thank you very much, Dr. Puka and Dr. Richardson. Dr. Weissman?
Thanks, Isabella. I'm also going to focus, I think, more on the gaps since Sarah was able to highlight so effectively in her introduction a lot of the progress that's been made from the LC initiative to the Feminist International Assistance Policy Equality Fund, sanctions for conflict-related sexual violence. Canada has made a lot of progress, but there is obviously, as the previous 2 speakers highlighted, a lot of room to improve. And I think at this moment of upheaval, where we are seeing such a backlash towards gender equality, where we are seeing a rise in authoritarianism, fascism, armed conflict, the convergence with climate change, and we're seeing a lot of human rights erode and a push against being more inclusive in the work that we're doing, at a moment where then military spending is rapidly increasing. So a lot of that progress has been wonderful, but what will the next 25 years hold? And I think there's some really important things to think about. In the report that I mentioned from the Women, Peace and Security Network, there were a number of questions that were posed. Is the National Action Plan for Women, Peace and Security adequately resourced? Well, it's a bit unclear. There's not a clear budget. There's not clear figures. And now with the rounds of budget cuts happening within Canada, what will that mean for that agenda? How has the action plan been implemented and monitored? Well, there are some indicators, but they apply only to some specific areas. And so it's not a comprehensive system of monitoring. What kind of leadership do we have? We have an office for an ambassador for women, peace, and security that was so aptly and very capably held by Ambassador O'Neill for these last many years. But that office currently sits vacant. Are there plans to staff it? It's unclear. And how will Canada continue to move forward with its commitment to intersectionality? So looking at women and girls in all of their diversity to ensure inclusivity as we move forward with this agenda, in particular with a lot of the backlash that we're seeing emerging from the United States, this piece is more critical than ever before. And so it really is important to see Canada take an important leadership role there. One of the areas that we are focusing on, in addition to intersectionality at CARE Canada, is the intersection of climate change and gender and peace and security. It remains really insufficiently integrated into the Women, Peace and Security programming and platform, and it's not a sufficient operational priority. And so this is a gap that we feel that Canada must close in order to aid peacebuilding partners and to effectively tackle the climate crisis. And one of the things that we point to at CARE Canada is we did a study in 2024, and we found that 4 out of the 5 top crises reported by women around the world, 4 out of 5 of them were directly linked to climate change. And so this was whether it was massive internal displacement to the collapse of livelihoods, social protection systems, we did find that these were all interconnected crises that were compounding protection risks for women and girls in all of their diversity, while also undermining their political participation and long-term recovery. So when we take those immense challenges and then you combine it with the underfunding, the chronic underfunding, and now loss of funding to women's rights and women-led organizations, we're really at a pivotal moment where if we don't invest properly, we will see some tremendous further backsliding in these areas. And so for us, investing in gender responsive and gender transformative climate justice is really not just an environmental necessity, but is really a catalyst for driving further change across gender equality and peace and security. So that's really where we're investing a lot of our time and resources at the moment.
Thank you very much, Dr. Weissman, and thanks to all the panelists for highlighting the gaps and how we should address it. And the next question, Canada is now 2 years into its third National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. In your opinion, what needs to change in how this plan is implemented to make sure that accountability and meaningful results happen by 2029?
I can go ahead.
Can I just say, Yolande, I'm going to cede my time to you and Emily on this one. Okay, so okay. I will pass.
Okay. We're 2 years into the third National Action Plan, but I would say we're really 1 year in because it wasn't made public for a very long time. So I think we should be fair in terms of how it's available to the public and then how we move forward. I think one of the first things we need is a new ambassador to continue to champion the National Action Plan and to lead the next round of consultation. The office is still active, but we do absolutely need an ambassador. Ambassador O'Neill was a fantastic leader who initiated a lot of amazing changes in how we think and conceptualize how to approach WPS from a Canadian perspective. And she's now moved on to other things and the post is still vacant. That's the first thing. The CNAP does a really good job, at least in my reading of it, in identifying some of these intersectional challenges that Emily talked about, identified the vulnerability of racialized and Indigenous communities, looked at extractive industries and the environment, but also looked at security sector institutions that are supposed to provide safety that have sometimes also been the perpetrators of violence. And so I think the CNAP has done a good job. But I think one of the challenges when we think about intersectionality and where the National Action Plan can yield better results is in our Canadian understanding of intersectionality that seems to highlight diversity and not the impetus of power. When the theory of intersectionality was brought up by various Black feminists over the course of decades, because it's not just Kimberly Crenshaw. Kimberly Crenshaw kind of, unfolds what she was able to learn from previous feminist scholars. It was the impetus of power and access to protection. And I think this is where we struggle because we use the word intersectionality in the CNAP and in our conversations, but we don't spend enough time thinking about power to be represented, power to have a line item on a budget, and power to change the actual policies. At the intersections of identity and representation, there is this challenge of seeing who has a word and who has the power to change the actual substantive representation, who has the power to change the policies. Some of the challenges come over again and again. And here we're talking about gender-based violence in the armed forces that continues to be an issue. gender-based violence in our policing forces and the RCMP, who are connected with indigenous communities, and the fact that the WPS agenda remains, and I'm gonna kind of paraphrase one of the questions in the Q&A in our conversation here by Joe Rodriguez. Joe, it's always lovely to have you among us about this. How do you reach out to indigenous communities about WPS without adding more labor onto them? And that's the same thing with Black communities and other racialized communities. What I think is particular in with the research network, our recent experience hosting our symposium in Saskatchewan and bringing former Indigenous women employees of the RCMP, is that the WPS did not factor in the documents and the policy frameworks that they were working on day in and day out. What does that tell me is that while the CNAP brings the intersection of these documents together, we have a fair challenge, but also a real inclusion, not symbolic in our documents, but how do you actually empower people with international commitments that our country has signed to empower marginalized communities within our countries to seek accountability for our governments. And that, I think, is where one of the many ways in which I think we should take the CNAP. The CNAP illustrates very clearly how it sits on and builds on other international and national commitments. And those intersections should then empower those who are at the bottom of the hierarchies of power within our societies, particularly Indigenous, racialized women and other types of marginalized communities.
Thank you very much, Dr. Buka. It's really great to hear about intersectionality, the importance of it being highlighted, and also great to hear about the local-global connections being a thread throughout this discussion. Dr. Weissman?
Yeah, thanks. I think I already touched on a few points in my previous answer, but I think, and Dr. Buka, I think, really comprehensively looked at the issues of power and intersectionality. And I think those are so important to think about. The question of who holds power and how is it wielded is really crucial here. And so I think in addition to this, I mean, some of the challenges that we've seen around the CNAP is that there are a few commitments for increased investment in women, peace, and security, but it's not clear what budget allocations are for those. And like I touched on in my previous answer, with cuts that are coming, what will this look like? What will this mean? It's not clear how these activities will be financed, and knowing that there will be such dramatic cuts across the government, I think it's really important that civil society really hold the government accountable to this and make sure that this plan continues to be adequately resourced. And I also mentioned KPIs for the National Action Plan. There are only 2 KPIs on resourcing. And they're only related to Global Affairs Canada, so they're not actually cross-cutting in terms of the whole National Action Plan. So that's also a concern, because what gets measured gets counted. And if you're not measuring that, then how do we know? And then there's also no, like we talked about, there's no dedicated staffing across implementing partners, despite the fact that you do need human resources to implement the policy. We know that the ambassador's office continues to sit vacant. And I think on that last point around the vacancy is when we did have the ambassador for women, peace, and security, that was such an important touch point. She was such an important interlocutor and collaborator with civil society, with academia. She really built tremendous bridges to ensure that the voices of those who are most impacted by Resolution 1325, by the National Action Plan, and those who will be most implemented if it's not fully and adequately implemented, that their voices were heard. When she would go travel to various countries, she would meet with civil society beforehand and say, what do I need to know? Who should I talk to? Who should I speak to? And that was such a crucial form of engagement that you don't often see from the government. And so having that office sit vacantly, and despite every effort to remain collaborative in her new role, it's really important to have that office be occupied and to have more touch points and more coordination with civil society, because we've really seen over the last year or so a reduction in engagement with civil society, not just in the National Action Plan, but in the foreign policy and international development assistance. We've really seen a step back from meaningful engagement with civil society actors. And so that, especially in a moment of rising authoritarianism around the world, is especially concerning. And then the final thing that I think I would focus on, again, as I mentioned in my previous answer, is that the CNAP does not systematically integrate environmental security or climate justice. And this really undermines Canada's feminist positioning, if it so chooses to continue in that route, and the plan's transformative potential. So, we really do need to recognize the overlapping dimensions of environmental degradation, militarism, and climate change intersecting with gender equality, and that if we don't really come up with a plan and if we don't address these effectively, it will risk weakening the whole women, peace, and security agenda. So this, for me and for Care Canada, is a crucial touch point, especially as they're looking to develop their new foreign policy, which could complement the CNAP and the challenges that exist with the CNAP as it is. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your insights, Dr. Weissman. So for all the panelists, the next question is that we often see strong policy commitments when it comes to women, peace, and security, but in reality, there's uneven implementation so often. In your experience, what does this look like? Who is most affected when women, peace, and security commitment falls short, and how?
Should I go? Yeah, okay. Vulnerable girls suffer. They possibly the most. When I think about, I had a meeting with several people involved in promoting different aspects of Indigenous participation. And I brought in, I don't know if maybe Emily Wiseman may have come across her in her work with CARE. Judith Bruce is, she's in New York. She's best friends with Jane Fonda, so she's about that age. And she is one of the architects of pulling together different UN agencies around the issue of adolescent girls and investing in adolescent girls. So when I finished my time at the UN in 2008 and moved back to Canada, and CARE had these amazing posters on every bus stop about girl something, can't even remember it very well, but it was really impactful. Anyway, so we met a couple of weeks ago, and there was a back and forth between her and a new friend of mine who's doing work in James Bay and other places to try and prevent suicide. And so this new friend described, suicide pacts between young girls, and that they had tried to provide programming to prevent the last of 8 girls from committing suicide in this Indigenous community. And what that they have found is that because of these layers of kind of subjugation and and then Judith was talking about, just the sexual violence at the community level that can happen. But it's almost like it's in some circumstances, and I don't want to speak out of turn because it's not my story to tell, but just this almost acceptance that because of the other ways that Indigenous people have been treated in Canada, these young girls have almost no choice but to sort of be more passive acceptors of this violence. It's almost like they, and so there's a lot of arm's length imposing, and that's not a very good kind of research approach. What I would want to do is do, interviews and understand this phenomenon more closely. But I just wanted to raise that it's the layers of what would cause a young woman to make a pact with her friends to take their own lives, that's how bad that has become, right? I think with the Hockey Canada example, we know that Canadian institutions like Hockey Canada had a slush fund, we know this now, to pay off victims of sexual violence by their hockey players. Why has there been no continuity to this? This is something that needs to be dealt with, for years and years. We need to grab this and, how could this be happening? And what else is happening that's similar to this, right? So in a larger sense, we know that when women are involved meaningfully in peace accords, peace is more lasting. So in a larger sense, if we deprive peace processes of women's participation, like Sarah spoke at the beginning of, it's still single digits in terms of women participating in peace processes, then we are depriving everybody of more durable, longstanding peace. And finally, I'm going to read something from Rigoberta Menchú, is a Nobel Peace Prize winning Guatemalan who tells her story. The chapters of the book are, it's always a bit shocking to look. I hadn't looked in a while. So chapter 26, the torture and death of her little brother burnt alive in front of members of his family and the community. Chapter 27, kidnapping and death of Rigoberta's mother. Chapter 23, in hiding in the capital, hunted by the army. So I'm just going to share this one passage here because I think what this shows is even under the incredible duress that Rigoberta Menchú was, she still found ways to help other women who needed more help, I guess, who need more help than she does, right? And that's kind of like, yeah, I mean, it's so inspiring. She said, another community nearby, the village of Cotzal, was very persecuted. It had been very badly repressed in 1960. From then on, there had been many massacres, many women raped, many men tortured. While I was in the village, a woman arrived, a very old woman. As my father said, unfortunately, we don't live long in Guatemala these days. We usually live to about 60. That's the life expectancy. People die early because of the conditions we live in, but this woman was extraordinary. She was an exceptional case in this village. She must have been about 90. They had just killed her last son. First, they'd killed her husband. He'd gone to town and hadn't come back. One of her sons went to look for him and he didn't come back. Another went and didn't come back either. The others were all kidnapped from their house. So this woman was left all alone. She was looking for a refuge. I was in the village and my compañero said there was a very old woman who wanted to join our community. She thinks she should stay here. I said, of course. She must. We must all help each other and defend ourselves to the very last person.
Thank you, Dr. Richardson, for sharing. And it is very heartbreaking, but very necessary reminder in Canada and beyond, Indigenous women and girls are still experiencing systemic and colonial violence. And we really need to have system reform, institutional reforms to address this issue. I would like to invite another panelist to answer this question.
Sure, I can go next. So in terms of the question of, what do we see from uneven implementation? One of the biggest challenges that we see in terms of uneven implementation is related to the work and support for women-led and women's rights organizations. Funding for women-led and women's rights organizations and feminist movements, while it has been something that's been on the agenda and it's seen strides, especially in Canada with the Feminist International Assistance Policy. And I think most folks have seen, that only 1% of total ODA goes to women's rights and women-led organizations. And while, as it was noted by Sarah, we have seen an increase in that, in particular, for global gender, peace, and security aid reaching local women's rights organizations in 2023, that went to a whopping 3.1%. So let's be clear, 3%. This is not enough. This is a very small portion of budgets, especially in a context where aid is shrinking, and that this support really remains limited in the types of work that it supports in terms of what it can do for organizations. So we still see inadequate support for psychosocial support for women human rights defenders and organizations. We see challenges around capacity sharing, flexibility in funding remains something that's really challenging to achieve. And when the aid does exist, something that we've still seen is that one of the biggest challenges is the overwhelming reporting requirements that funders still place on these women's rights and women-led organizations, which creates a real burden and limits their ability to focus on the actual issues that are salient and pressing within their communities, within the community dynamics. And when they can't fulfill that reporting requirement, it excludes them from the aid, which then excludes them from key forums and opportunities to represent their communities, which then furthers the structural inequalities that remove them from key spaces, like having legal registration, for example. And so when we see these sort of commitments fall short, it impacts most the communities that they work in, that they represent, and in particular, women and girls, especially those from more marginalized communities. And so one of the models that we do have that I think has been really successful at CARE is a model called Women Lead in Emergencies, and it's specifically designed to support women's leadership in crisis and protracted crises situations. And through this model, we support local women to drive humanitarian action, ensure their voices and expertise and leadership are central to crisis preparedness, response, and advocacy, and ensuring that voices of women who would otherwise be unrepresented are brought to the fore. And so we had an example recently in Ukraine where we were able to use this Women Lead in Emergencies model, and that was able to bring the voices of Roma women to the front and to be able to have their concerns addressed, because there were otherwise no other mechanisms for Roma women to share their experiences, to share their voices. And so through this model, though, we were able to support them to participate in the Women Lead in Emergencies model, to become leaders within their communities, to become UN protection officers, and work with the most vulnerable and trusted of frontline resources. They were able to lead on advocacy. They were able to improve waste management services for entire Roma communities. And they were able to demonstrate an impact that otherwise would have been completely overlooked if they had not been included. But the ripple effects of this, we can't estimate. We can't always measure down to the last person that is impacted, because you're measuring for things you otherwise wouldn't see if they weren't included. And that is part of a challenge. And because we can't always capture these results in the way that government log frames want us to, they miss out. They aren't included in funding. And we've had a really hard time receiving funding for this type of programming because it's not viewed as life-saving, when the reality is this type of programming is reducing the most significant barriers to accessing life-saving services that women and girls who would otherwise be excluded face in these communities. And so this is one of the challenges that we really have, is getting funders to be willing to think differently, think about who has power, who holds it, who yields it, who's excluded, and be willing to try new models. And so this is one of the areas that still remains such a crucial need to reflect on, and for governments to rethink, because, you know, they're so focused on increased military spending, but they're not focused on the fact that, you know, countries that are more unequal, that have lower rates of gender equality, are less peaceful. They aren't, like, they're just not focused on the right piece of the puzzle here. And so I think that's my time, but I'll hand it over to the others.
I agree wholeheartedly with my co-panelists. And I think one of the one of the very many myths that we share and that we kind of tend to believe in is that stated commitments and stated normative commitments automatically lead to who we are and what we do. And unfortunately, that's not the case. And so a little bit of realism is necessary for us to engage with government stakeholders. And I think some of those challenges that have been pointed by both Emma and Emily are so key. When I think just the last point on reporting, and then if you can't report the way the system wants you to report, you're no longer deemed a suitable partner for peace or suitable partner for women in peace and security, in a context that I think is unrealistic to have these types of expectations, particularly when we don't have the legitimacy or the capacity to implement projects everywhere. I think some of these conditionalities are quite colonial in their framing and paternalistic, to deem partners ineligible and inadequate because of administrative burden that we put on reporting, when our own government institutions can't even hold themselves accountable on those very stated positions that they claim to legitimize their work off, if that makes sense, right? So one thing that I like to look at is other examples. How do other institutions and how do other regions and countries hold themselves accountable? And because I work primarily on the African continent, I like to think about the Continental Results Framework for WPS. Now, of course, Africa is the region with one of the largest number of national action plans, but there's also a lot of inequalities and various reasons why you have instabilities. And I'm not going to bore you with all the data and the theories I have to do with neocolonialism and so on and so forth. But the bottom line is that one thing that I really appreciate about feminists who work in that space, but also in the African Union, but also the Office of the Special Envoy on WPS, is that there's no fear to measure what is measurable. And so Africa as a continent has been on the forefront of advocating for WPS. Well, everybody at NATO, when I had a recent visit, is very worried about the survival of the BPS in that space. Things are still going with the Windhoek initiative and new mandates and so forth. But there's no fear to try to measure. And they've developed over the past few years a continental results framework. And countries have to go through this painful process, not of counting dimes, but saying, we said our national action plan was going to do this. This is our report card. And it's sometimes embarrassing to engage in that exercise, but it's a necessary one. If you state a position and you champion a position, you have to fund that position, and then you have to account for the actions of that set position in order for that position to actually count for something more than a diplomatic tool. And I'm not trying to make any arguments that the Foreign Assistance Program or the CNAP is a performance or a stated position, but this is also the labor of feminist activists within this country that sometimes our federal government can capitalize on for diplomatic purposes. So we can't let the government get away with saying, yes, we'll go through cabinet, we'll sign this action plan, but we will not find the time or the resources to measure whether we're going to be accountable for this. And ultimately, who loses is all of us. It's our domestic society, it's our international partners, it's those who are the most vulnerable. It is, in some cases, women and girls, not all women and girls. It's also gender minorities, sexual minorities, and in the rise of authoritarianism, what we see as well is the rise of fascism and the rise of anti-gender, anti-LGBTQ plus communities. And it is also the further marginalizations of men and boys who don't fit the idealized kind of hegemonic masculinity. It is the environment that loses, and it is our future generations that lose out, right? So in this entire ecosystem, the failure to implement what we know is the prerequisite for inclusive, democratic, sustainable societies and peaceful societies ultimately makes all of us losers in the long run.
Thank you very much for your comprehensive answer, Dr. Buka. So for the final question, as we look ahead to 2029, what is one priority action you believe Canada must take to strengthen its leadership on women, peace, and security? And what role can civil society, youth, and independent experts play in getting us there?
I can go. I haven't gone first in a while.
I just don't want to go last. That's all. I want Yolanda to go last.
Do you want to go first then?
No, you go first. I'll go second.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to pick. I think we've touched on so many, and there are so many things that Canada can and should prioritize. I think I could probably give 20. I mean, as a reminder, I just think, filling the role of the ambassador for women, peace, and security is just so essential, especially as we look forward to carrying out the final national action plan. And I was reminded that, so far the government has yet to report on the current national action plan at all. And so I think making sure that there is that leadership present to be able to be that vocal voice where the decisions happen at a high level of leadership is really crucial. That role is more essential than ever. I've also already mentioned the need to look at the intersection of gender, climate, and peace. And I think that in particular is important, not just, globally in the work that we do internationally through international development assistance and through that mechanism, but it's also so crucial in Canada. As we see the impacts of climate change within our own country that is impacting communities here, and how that's going to impact the women of all backgrounds in those communities is something that is going to need to be assessed comprehensively and have a plan for addressing it. So I think, going back to the integration of Indigenous voices, going back to the inclusion of women of all backgrounds, these are things that need to happen systematically. And one of the ways to do that is to really build those bridges with civil society and to make sure that there is a strong linkage between civil society within Canada and with the actions that the government is taking. This is, a crucial component of democracy, but it's also the most important entry point that we have to making sure that we're able to hold the government to account. And I think that's something that all, civil society, youth, independent experts, these are things that all of us can do. We can all write our members of parliament and say, it's important to us to have an ambassador for women, peace, and security. It's important that as you're increasing defense spending, you're looking at what kind of impact this is going to have on northern communities. It's important to us that you invest in international development assistance. It's important to us that you continue to maintain your feminist values in an international development assistance policy. These things matter. It's not just all about trade. It's not just all about the United States, that it is about our core Canadian values. And so making sure that we really are holding the government and all the other power holders to account on these pieces. So that's what I would identify. But I think there's a lot that we can look at.
Thank you, Dr. Weissman. Dr. Richardson?
Thank you so much. This is actually, I knew I would learn a lot being in this panel, but it's actually been really encouraging and inspiring for something that I am in the middle of also taking on that I'll allude to. It's kind of my third sub point here. But first, I wanted to just share with Yolanda, I hope it's okay, I'm calling you Yolanda. Is that correct? Okay. So or actually Emily raised it, the sort of like, let's get organized. Can you show us, your log frames and it reminds me of when I gave birth to our eldest and my husband and I came flying in, and it was like, oh, the doctor told us, you're just not, come back when you're organized, and I went home and then I'm like writhing around in the park because somebody told me it was a good idea to go for a walk in the park. I'm on the ground and a neighbor was like, you need to get to hospital. So off I went back to hospital and my husband had a clipboard the second time and they just let us right in, and I gave birth like half an hour later. So I just reminded me of that. I think there's a few parallels there. When we involve youth, civil society, and independent experts, what are we doing? I think youth, I did a lot of work with adolescents and youth and helped to stand up the Ministry for Youth in Honduras when it was newly created in 2008. And I think just off the, I was thinking what I might say to this question. I think just sort of intuitively, young people are old enough, but not too old to really be able to take on, peace after. They don't hold grudges to the same extent. I saw it in Nicaragua. My young friends who had previously been on both sides of their civil war, basically civil war, during the Sandinista time, they were friends again, like in the same neighborhood. So I think that young people have a lot of capacity to kind of continue to look forward. And it's not to say that grudges aren't, held for good reason. But I just think that there's an immense capacity to avoid that kind of like overly binary view of life when you're young. So as Canadians, at the United Nations, because Sarah opened this panel, and at home, we must recognize the injustices just outside our front door, and indeed inside our own homes. I was, until this past weekend, heavily involved in a possible political run. I have to say possible because I'm a federal public servant and I'm not at liberty to say until I get permission again, right? Until I'm organized from the Public Service Commission about running. So I was running to replace Chrystia Freeland in University of Rosedale, which is the riding where I grew up. And I had an anecdote about this because the Riding Association, which is kind of, that's the consistent body that will cover, span more than one election, right? These are the people who are involved in the whatever party. For whatever reason, it's 90% young men. And that does not represent the breadth of that riding that spans, I don't know how, like it's a diverse riding. It's also got the richest neighborhood probably in the country as well, right? But it's not just one thing. And I've seen that in other associations for different ridings. So if we're talking about who is sort of helping to negotiate, and I say this with the utmost, I grew up with nothing but my younger brothers, my dad, my stepdad. My mom passed away when I was quite young. Like I'm used to being with, not that there's anything wrong with that kind of thing, particularly. There's nothing wrong with young men, but we do need to make sure that we're deliberate in thinking about these spaces. And so I think what I'm trying to do, and there's others as well in this space, we all notice we're like, there's barely any women here. How can we support, invite, try to lift up any woman who comes even close, who wants to become involved. I encourage everyone to become involved in their riding associations for whatever party they believe in, because that is what is going to help the right candidate, become the next parliamentarian or member of parliament. Okay, so that's that one. On an international level, the United Nations is also suffering, as Sarah Hendricks alluded to, major cuts across the board. I know I was just in Guatemala. I spoke to my old colleagues from the UN there, and they've had to let go of 50% of their staff. But there is an interesting opportunity, and just speaking about expertise, we need people who know what they're doing to advise and help our Canadian government to help the UN set up what's probably going to happen is a merger between UN Women and UN Population Fund. So let's help them do that properly, because the way UN Women was set up, and I don't know if Sarah's still on this call, I don't know if she would agree with this, but when I started representing Canada at UN Women, I sought advice from people. And one of the pieces is that UN Women was not best set up to succeed because of the way it's funded. It was put in competition with other agencies at the local level. So we need to make sure that whatever this next entity is, has a setup that's maybe more similar to, I think somebody mentioned that they worked on, more similar to the Global Compact, I think it is, or other like, these are details, and I'm kind of fuzzy on them right now, but we need to think through those details. It matters how, like Yolande has been saying, and Emily, like the budgeting matters so much. It's not just about saying, oh, we have a new UN agency, great, but are we setting it up to fail? Because that's not what we're trying to do here as Canadians, and it's not what we're trying to do with the UN. So the last point, when we go abroad as individual Canadians, which often happens towards the beginning and the end of our careers. We often have the best intentions, but I think it's really important. And I wasn't a good example of this. It's really important to understand we're not going there really to help as much as we're going there to learn, to observe, and then maybe, eventually, once we've been able to pull some pieces together, we might be able to contribute. But to just be humble, let's be humble. Canadians are quite humble, I would say, like relative to some other countries. But we can still, I think we can dig deeper and lean into that and be more constructive and less afraid to build as we think is best. Thank you.
Thank you so much to my co-panelists. There's so much we could spend probably just another half a day trying to imagine the future and trying to think about what needs to be done. And I definitely agree with a lot that was said. I agree that we need to get, when I'm not doing women, peace, and security or security in African countries, I also teach introduction to women, gender, and politics at Queen's. And one of the concepts that I try to teach my students is the concept of homosocial capital. What happens when people of a particular gender get to dominate a space, and when they look at competence as what looks like them and feels like them at every level of government, and how that impacts who's chosen, who's selected to be the candidate for a riding or political party. And so what Emma is talking about is actually important. And I also think that we need to care as well we need to care about local politics. We need to get young people to care about local politics. The budgeting, we can get a better sense of how budgeting works at different levels of government if we start small. And small is our own cities. And a lot of the WPS work that could be done in this country could be done at the city level, right? In the women's shelters, in the youth institutions, and in the schools, and in all the places where we go on a day-to-day basis. So I think it's important to think, and this is something that I really appreciate about learning from CSOs who do WPS work in other countries around the world, is that the local matters, not only elsewhere, but also where we're standing. So we actually need to learn to lift where we stand. I also think it's important to think about our public messaging, and I've already said that a little bit earlier. My kids can't remember to brush their teeth. They can't remember to make their beds. They choose not to remember a lot of things. But when we sit in the car and there's commercials, they can recite the commercials from beginning to end. That's just fascinating to me. They remember all the lyrics from the songs, and they remember commercials. And the reason why I bring that up is that the Ontario government has been using a lot of resources to share their message through radio commercials. I've noticed recently that the federal government has been doing the same thing. Where are our commercials? How do we sensitize our own populations about the fundamental, the fact that it's essential to put the elements of the WPS agenda at the forefront of how we think about democracy, about sustainable peace, about sustainable development? I think we need to work on our messaging. We need to think, yeah, exactly. There's, those commercials, we keep them in mind. And I think this is, it's not a game per se, but we live in a society of fast consumerism and limited attention spans. And so it's difficult to hold our governments accountable if the general population is not aware. If I move into a new neighborhood in Ontario and I don't have my green bin to put my compost, I'm going to be turning around and say, what happened to my green bin? Because in Southern Ontario, that's a thing. I've been taught about the importance of composting and recycling since I was a child growing up in Quebec, right? That's because there's a way in which these types of norms have become ingrained in what we do, right? It would be a beautiful world to include young people in participating in thinking about what WPS and why WPS, youth, peace, and security. What does that look like for them in their own community? Right? Do peer-to-peer exchanges with communities here and communities in Guatemala and communities in various parts of the world, right? But that requires citizenship engagement. And I'll finish on with this. And I say this a lot, we live in a moment of polycrisis. That's the new word that everybody is mentioning, right? There's a lot of crises happening at the same time, and they intersect, interlock. Prime Minister Carney made a speech recently about the world system, and we knew it was a story, but we kind of followed the story because it benefited us, because it was giving us a public good. A lot of people applauded the talk. I think people in the global majority and critical thinkers have been saying this, and indigenous communities have been saying this for a very long time, so there was nothing new there. But it also comes at a moment of inflection where we actually have to decide whether, as some of our allies are asking for increased military funding, and the fact that we are living in an increasingly unsafe world for our understanding. I think if you talk to people in Northern Ontario, they'll tell you that their lives have been unsafe for quite some time. It's also a perception of who's safe and who's not. While this is a reality, we have to be able to, and I think the people who were with me yesterday heard me say the same thing. We have to be able to hold in tension the fact that we are in an increasingly militarized world, and that we need to know how to defend our society, while understanding that every dollar that we spend towards fossil fuel supported military spending has an impact on the environment, has an impact on the sustainable development of our planet, is also a dollar we're not spending on education, on healthcare, on infrastructure, is also money that we're not spending on promoting equality. And sometimes you have to go 50-50, sometimes you have to go 75-25, but we have to be able to hold these two realities in tension. And while we're giving good speeches on the international scene, it is also a moment for ordinary Canadians to think, what is it that I want Canada to be when we get out of this crisis and enter a new one? Right. And one thing that I think is important and is the fact that we need to change, or to need to target our messaging so that young people and ordinary Canadians feel empowered to make changes in their societies and in their own communities. And that is going to help us hold our government accountable on those broader normative framework that it touts abroad, but struggles to keep account domestically. So yeah, that's, I think, one of the many ways in which we can move forward as we move towards 2029 and the next iteration of the National Action Plan.
Thank you very much, Dr. Buka. I would like to thank all our panelists for their thoughtful contributions on the important topic of women, peace, and security in Canada and beyond. It has been very enriching to learn from your professional and lived expertise, also drawing on different sectors such as academia, policy, civil society, and Indigenous perspectives. Now I'm going to request the audience members to share any questions they might have for our panelists. Due to the interest of time, we have about 10 minutes of Q&A left. So I will be picking 3 to 5 questions, and then I would like to request the panelists to respond to the questions in a concise manner. Thank you. So we already have some questions. I will first start with the question from Joe. Thank you for your insight, folks. I found one reaching out to Indigenous organizations and folks on doing work on women, peace, and security, that they see it as just another document that doesn't recognize them. What approaches could be used to involve, invite, and listen to Indigenous women in Canada without them having to do repeated labor and avoiding the experience of not being heard again? Also, what you said to Indigenous people, women, girls, LGBTQIA plus community when asked, how will working on WPS and advocating it help them in a way that doesn't re-traumatize them? Would anyone like to take on this question?
Well, I can speak to it because I've mentioned it because I was trying to respond to Joe's question when she asked it. I think one of the ways to do this, and it requires, and it's like the thing, right? You need to work in community, but even in community work, you have to recognize power asymmetries, and you also have to recognize that some communities have done the work for so long that they get tired of being asked, and in a symbolic way, they get tired of being asked to and then to redo the work and then disappear and say, we've consulted with Indigenous communities and we did great, yay. I think it requires us to go to the various communities. And I speak about this from somebody who is a member of a marginalized community in this country. And for example, this month is Black History Month, and I'm just not responding to Black History Month requests anymore. Like, I'm kind of done and over it, you know? So one of the things that we've done as a network, and we haven't been sustainably successful, is trying to host our events in different parts of the country, because there is a power concentration, for example, in the Ottawa, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver spaces, right? So when we decided to host our annual symposium in Saskatoon one year, or in Halifax and another, in Halifax we worked with both Indigenous and Black communities there because of the historic ties and the history of dispossession there. And in Saskatchewan, we relied on our partners who are based in Saskatchewan to reach to their own communities and the partners that they already had, as opposed to try to cold call people who don't know who you are. And the intent was for them to introduce them to a tool that they could use to hold local, provincial, and federal government accountable. Listen, the CNAP mentions this about Indigenous women, and then the CNAP itself is based on 10 previous Canadian commitments. So we're not just coming to this to ask you for the goodness of your heart to help us find our loved ones, for example, but we're doing this with an internationally committed document of the Canadian government. And what was interesting, and we did not change the world, and we did not shatter new anything, but was interesting was to realize that the 5 women who were there that day first had not heard of the WPS agenda, even though they work with they used to work with RCMP or adjacent to RCMP in that space. So they were very well informed about peace and security and gender in their own communities, but that they thought this could be useful, right? The extent to which they are able to capitalize on this is another thing. The extent to which our local partner has continued to work with them is a wonderful accomplishment, and she continues to work with them. But that's just one example. Marginalized groups get tired of being asked when it's trendy, and they get tired of being asked if they're not considered equal partners. And in the space in which we are, we have to move to people. The same way I no longer do workshops with African activists and scholars based here. I go in places where they can travel without going through the humiliating migration visa regime that the Canadian government makes to get them go through. So we need to move. We need to use resources as opposed to trying to bring them into our circles. And that requires time, commitment, and actual care.
Thank you very much, Dr. Buka. I can relate to a lot of the things that you said, particularly when it comes to being asked about Speak on Myanmar as well. A lot of the times people only care about certain countries when it's the anniversary of the coup, for example, and they would look for a token woman. And During my time at Queen's learning from you, I've learned to say no, and it feels pretty powerful. So thank you for that. Anyone else wanted to answer this question? Okay, so we have another question by Beth in the Q&A chat, and we also have a comment. The comment first. On CNAP 3, we have yet to see a single progress report. There is a commitment to release them annually. And for the question, Prime Minister Kearney has been clear that the world is changing. You have highlighted some of the challenges. How do we make the case for women, peace, and security commitments in this new environment?
I'm happy to take a stab. I think just to thank Beth so much for the questions, but also for those of you who don't know, Beth is one of the best leaders and champions on women, peace, and security in Canada. So really wonderful to have her here today. I wish I had a fabulous answer to how we could convince the current government that they should invest in women, peace, and security, and that gender equality is important, and that the fiat matters, and that the commitments to women, peace, and security are really crucial at this time. I think, at the most fundamental level, gender equality, as we know, is fundamental in terms of lasting peace, and is in terms of achieving security and democracy, and that countries that are less gender equal are more likely to be more insecure, which then drives a further system of more militarism and more conflict. And so, if their interest is around robust international trade and building new alliances, peace and security are core foundations to that. And so if you don't have peace and security, you won't have strong international trade, and you won't have strong economic growth. You won't be able to, reap the full benefits of trade. And so, if you make that a full circle, without gender equality, you're not going to get peace. Without peace, you're not going to get lasting trade. That seems to be the instrumentalist argument that maybe would resonate most with this government at this time. But, I think otherwise, a few weeks ago, we had really fruitful conversations with DND. And so making sure that as they are investing in more security and more militarism, at least if they can be compliant with the CNAP, at least if they can be looking at, implementing better policies around when sexual harassment and abuse does happen, around ensuring investment in women peace builders and women's leadership within the armed forces, and transforming the armed forces themselves. It's unfortunate that we're looking for things that I feel like 15 to 20 years ago we just sort of said, oh, we've moved on from this, and we're going back to these conversations that are much more instrumental. But unfortunately, it seems to be the moment that we're in, and we have a lot of re-education to do with those that are in power. So I'll leave it at that, because I know we're short on time.
I have one thought on this one, which is that flattery works sometimes. So if we can find anything that is happening in Parliament that is consistent with the third policy, the third women, peace, and security policy. For example, on the second last day of Parliament, there was legislation about gender-based violence. And I will admit, I actually haven't looked at it in detail. I'm not sure what's in there, but what is in there? Let's look, let's support and that, I was waiting for that, because politically right now, there is a bit of an alignment between the Conservatives and the Liberals in terms of crime. They both want to be seen to be strong on crime, especially the Conservatives, right? And then the Liberals need the Conservatives because they don't have a majority, or they need somebody. So for me, I was like, there are people, we saw like femicide happening a lot across the country this year. Some shocking, it happens all the time, unfortunately, but like especially out east as well, like for what, that's the ones that caught the headlines at least. So let's scoop up whatever we can that's relevant and help to do that part right, at least, right? We might not be able to get all of what we want depending on the different sort of junctures. And I guess that's kind of, that's part of the reason I'm trying to run, is because this is the way that I like my brain works. I'm always like, okay, well, where can we move forward? Because I found when I was in academia, for me, it was a lot of like like I sort of was drowning myself in what I could see as all of the problems. And I found it actually depressing. Like it was, it's like a mental health thing for me. Whereas now that I'm in, like I was very grumpy, very grumpy. But now it's yeah. So I think that's it's just a quick little thought, but I think, and I'm not familiar enough. This is why I've ceded my time on the question 3 or whatever it was, because I am not current on the details of a lot of these issues, but my sense is that, and if I can help with anything, from now or whenever it happens, and I hope that we can stay in touch, including with, many of the very esteemed audience members, because we do all have a common interest in moving this agenda forward, and we can do so from our various spaces, encouraging young people, all those things, and hopefully, it will, and then when the opportunity kind of opens, we're ready. We're not scrambling. So
I'll just add quickly, because I know I spoke a lot already. I'll just add quickly that we have to be careful when we deal with a government that, for all intent and purposes, is governing right to center when it comes to issues of gender and safety and protection. So I would push a little bit against Emma's conversation about, crime, because when we think about crime, we have to be careful not to slide on that slippery slope of carceral feminism. We also have to think about which communities end up being more policed, and then end up being more vulnerable to more violence. At the same time, we do have to think about how to be pragmatic. Some people are wondering, do we keep terminologies like equity, equality, gender in a world where these words are no longer popular? Some people say yes, some people say no. I guess it depends on the space where you're operating. But I would make the argument that looking at international relations and the trajectory of politics in various countries, unfortunately or fortunately, gender equality remains a leftist priority. And people can be angry at me for saying this, but that's just what I see around the world. And what people have done in various positions where the left has shrunk is try to cozy up to the right to get the votes. That's what's happened in the US. This is where they are now. And that's what happened in France. And this is where they are now. And I think we have an opportunity to get lessons learned and to stand firm and find coalitions in the left that will help us achieve our goals. Trying to bring the right on issues of gender is likely going to undermined our effort. So how do you work with a government? Well, that is governing right to center, but claims to be leftist, left to right government, is to remind them who voted for them, and who put them back in a context where it was a responsive vote with what was going down south, as opposed to a vote that had to do anything with the survival of the Liberal Party. So holding them accountable to what we still want out of that party, and maybe looking on other smaller parties for a moving forward agenda is what we need to do. Trying to cozy up to the right, and I'm sorry to say this, in an Ontario setting, has not been successful in other countries. And that's actually been detrimental to our cause. So I'm just being honest on this.
Thank you, everyone, including our panelists and audience members, for participating in the Q&A session. We are going to wrap up the Q&A session, but I know that there are some audience questions that are not answered yet. So the OCIC team will share an email address where you can send in the questions, and they are happy to redirect you to the panelists or answer the questions. It is very encouraging to see your interest in the Women, Peace and Security agenda and Canada's National Action Plan today. And once again, I would like to thank our panelists for taking the time out of their busy day to share their expertise with us. I deeply appreciate the wonderful work that you are doing to advance women, peace, and security in different sectors. Now over to you, Pragya.
Thank you so much to our esteemed panelists, starting with our keynote speaker, Sarah Hendricks, and to our panelists, Dr. Emily, Dr. Yolan, and Dr. Emma, for your insight and expertise. Last but not the least, thank you so much to our wonderful moderator, Isabella, for today's session. It's been such an honor and a pleasure to learn from all of you. I will, and I'm sure you will too, continue to reflect on today's discussion. I would now like to invite everyone to please complete a short Zoom poll that should be launching on your screens now. While you complete the poll, I take the opportunity to also thank my wonderful team here. We have Shahara, Sarah, Mishka, Kim, and Lisa. And also, I would like to thank our Global Affairs Canada team, our colleagues from the Engaging Canadian branch, for all of their support in making this event happen and all of our International Development Week events happen. With that, I would like to thank all of you for joining us today. I hope you have a great day ahead. Thank you.